I give you a warm, hearty welcome. My name's Darren Nixon, for those who don't know me. I'm the project coordinator with Spur and Cultural Awareness, based here in Macrophil. And I want to welcome you all along to this very small event today, but a poignant event for the launch of our booklet. On that note, I want to give a very warm welcome to a good friend and author of the booklet here today, Martin Snoddon. As I said earlier on, today is very informal, but I want to first of all provide some background into the origins of the booklet, and then I'll pass to Martin then, who will present a small, short synopsis of the booklet itself. So over the past few years, Martin and I has been supporting myself in terms of mentoring, and we've had many cups of teas and conversations and debates around the topic of unionism. And obviously, at this point in the year, the topic of the centenary of Northern Ireland was obviously discussed. We were very keen to provide a platform of factual education that could be outreached and available at first hand to communities. And we recognised that the need of the design of the booklet had to be based on the timeline of events that led up to this momentous year 2021. So once again, thank you all for attending, and I'll now hand proceedings over to Martin.
Okay, thank you very much, Darren. I would just like to start by complimenting Darren and his squad at Spur and Cultural Awareness Association for all the work that they've done, the tremendous work that they've done over the past lot of years. It's second to none in many ways. The depth of the work in terms of promoting loyalism, that positivity in relation to loyalism is fantastic, and their whole strategic way forward is tremendous as well. So I certainly want to congratulate them for all they do. And the network that is obvious here today of people who are generally working for the good and the betterment of the community is fantastic to be a part of it. But the booklet itself is really a lockdown booklet in many regards. There's nothing like a blooming lockdown to keep you stuck at your desk, out in your shed that you call a chalet, and hammer away at the keyboard, a wooden shed. But, I have to say that whenever I started it, I said, right, okay, wee short booklet here, a wee bit of information here and there. I'll have a wee nosy around and see what research there is around the place. And I've been teaching Aries history for a number of years, but whenever I sat down to go into this particular booklet, I just got through deeper and deeper and deeper into it, as I started to get a connection here that was flagging something up over there in Hazlitt's book about the bee specials there, 1920 to 1925 booklet over there. It was absolutely fantastic. I have thoroughly enjoyed writing the booklet, and I've thoroughly enjoyed working with Darren with regards to the production of it. But it is what it is. It's a centenary year and a time for celebration, even though we recognise that the time that we're talking about was anything really about celebrating. Those were difficult years back at that particular time. Indeed, they probably stretch back to the United Irishmen Rebellion of 1798 and the chaos that took place after that or during that, which actually led to the Act of Union of 1801, and which indeed took rule away from Ireland and placed it at Westminster. Then you come up into the mid-1860s and you have the Finian Uprising. And the Finian Uprising is about trying to get the power to control people's lives back here in Ireland. And after that, of course, you have the rise and the fear of Home Rule. Fear within the Protestant community that Home Rule was actually Rome Rule. And there's probably not much of an argument that you can put against that whenever you look at history itself in terms of the states. But we had that period, and then we had the call for Home Rule in Westminster, the first Home Rule Bill in Westminster. And it was 1886, and then the second one, 1893. Moving through to the third Home Rule Bill that was introduced in April 1912. And we know 1912. 1912 is written in most people's hearts in the room with regards to what was taking place about the Ulster Covenant, and then January 1913, the formation of the UVF and the transition into the 36th Ulster Division. and the Aries Volunteers in November 1913, and the majority of their transition either into the 10th or the 16th Aries divisions and going off and fighting in World War I. And of course, during World War I, we had the Ulster Rising, largely led by those members of the Aries Volunteers who stayed behind, probably quite a number of them members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, including Michael Collins. Michael Collins had returned to Ireland from London, where he had worked as a civil servant during World War I. And of course, whenever the rebels were released after the Ulster Rising, their movement into Sinn Féin and that particular trajectory that took place at that time, leading to the success of their movement in December 1918, the elections of that time, and the major successes of Sinn Féin with over 70 members elected, and indeed in the northeast of Ireland, as it was then, the predominance of the Unionists being elected, over 20 members elected there. And that created a platform for Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin chose abstentionism from Westminster and set up the first Dáil in January of 1919. And it's on the same day that the first shots were fired in what becomes known as the Irish War of Independence. And that Irish War of Independence runs through 1919 into 1920. And it was a case that the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Republican Army, had learned the lesson of 1916 with regards to they weren't equipped to stand and face to face the British Army. So it becomes an insurgency with flying columns across most of Ireland, but not necessarily that much taking place in the northeast, particularly the 6 counties that becomes Northern Ireland. But the operational divisional command structure of the Irish Republican Army at that time did stretch across the whole island. And in response to the activities of the IRA's activities, those people in the northeast of Ireland decided that they needed to have self-protection. They felt better if they were self-protected rather than dependent on the British government at that time. And they formed the B Specials, and the A Specials, the B Specials, and the C Specials indeed. But just prior to that, they had formed vigilante groups. And one of the primary people with regards to the formation of those groups was none other than our good old Fermanagh man from Colebrook. What's his name? Goes on to become Northern Ireland Prime Minister. Lord Brookborough. So Brookborough had formed that first vigilante group, and within that particular group in Fermanagh, they had Lieutenant Colonel George Little. And Lieutenant Colonel George Little actually had a good group of men around him for whenever the IRA came to attack Lisbon. And they were lying in wait and chased the IRA out of the town. And most of those vigilantes become members of the Ulster Special Constables, which was formed to protect those people who were loyal to the Crown, whether they were Protestant or Catholic at that particular time. During those difficult times, what becomes known as the Fourth Home Rule Bill, the Government of Ireland Act of 1920 is introduced, and it received royal assent on the 23rd of December 1920, and its commencement date was the 3rd of May 1921. And Carson had actually advised Unionists to take no responsibility for it, but also not to oppose it. So he didn't want them to be responsible for it, but neither did he want them to be opposing it, because they felt at that particular time that it's better having some control over your own destiny than actually being governed from Dublin itself. So the Dáil immediately rejected the idea that was within the Government of Ireland Act to have 3 separate bodies in place in Ireland: a southern government in Dublin, a northern government in Belfast, and then a joint government between the two, where the British hoped that relationships would improve and lead, when I say the British, sorry, I should say the English, indeed the Welsh wizard himself, Lloyd George, hoped that relationships would improve that much that eventually there would be a united Ireland governed from Dublin. Carson made it clear that Ulster Unionists wanted to be ruled by Westminster, not by a local parliament. Edward Carson was an integrationist with regards to the United Kingdom. His preferred, that preferred option of integration was chosen over what was being offered at that stage in terms of devolution. James Craig said, if, at this particular time, moving into later in May for the elections of the new Northern Ireland government, James Craig actually said on the election trail, if Ulster listens to me and if Ulster believes in me, as I believe she does, I will carry them through and I will win this contest and sweep the 6 counties for loyalty as against the Republic. Go into the fight feeling that you deserve good and got salvation, and in me you have a leader who will never desert you and who will never betray you. Craig and the Ulster Unionists, the election results on the 24th of May 1921, for the 52 MPs that were elected, 40 were Unionist, 6 were members of the Aries Parliamentary Party, and 6 were members of Sinn Féin. Of those members of Sinn Féin, 4 of them were actually senior significant figures with regards to the Republican movement. So Michael Collins had stood and was elected in Armagh. Eamon de Valera had stood and was elected in South Down. Arthur Griffith had stood and was elected in Fermanagh and Tyrone. And Owen McNeill had stood and was elected in Londonderry. None of them took their seats. So the people that elected them were not represented in the first Parliament of Northern Ireland. But even with those hostilities still taking place, remember the War of Independence was still raging. James Craig, being the man that he was, the veteran soldier that he was, chose to go down to Dublin to meet with Eamon de Valera in the heat of the campaign, the conflict, the War of Independence. And whenever Craig got off the train, he said in his biography, he was met by 3 of the toughest, meanest looking people that he could ever imagine. And they got him into a car and they drove him round the back streets of Dublin to a secret destination where he met with Eamon de Valera. And he reports in his biography that he left extremely disappointed with his meeting. And the reason that he states is because Eamon de Valera talked only about 700 years of past misrule by the Empire. Whereas James Craig was there to talk about the present and the future of both states and the betterment for both. So he had left disappointed. During this time, we also had the Belfast boycott, the trade boycott taking place. And predominant amongst the people who were against that boycott, who were working the boycott, was coming a man, the Irish Women's Council. They were to the fore of pushing that boycott. And, the most common form of that boycott was inflicted on firms trading with Belfast companies or banks. So that was taking place. There was still a tax taking place, and there was a tax taking place all over Ireland. 22nd of June 1921, we have the state opening of Parliament. And the state opening of Parliament with regards to King George V and Queen Mary coming over to Belfast, having been advised not to come because of the danger, but coming in good faith. And the King had a speech made out for him by top civil servants, and also on the fingerprints of Lloyd George would have been on that speech. And it was an appeal to the people of Ireland with regards to reconciliation. And this is what the King had said in Belfast City Hall at that time.
Belfast City Hall were gathered the elected Unionist MPs, senators, and all their wives. Nationalists and Sinn Féiners had held to their pledge not to enter the North Eastern Parliament. The King made a speech. He intended his speech to reach far beyond the walls of the City Hall, and this is what he said. I speak from a full heart when I pray that my coming to Ireland today may prove to be the first step towards an end of strife amongst our people, whatever their race or creed. In that hope, I appeal to all Irish men to pause, to forgive and forget, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, and to join in making for the land which they love a new era of peace, contentment and goodwill.
The portrait that was made by an artist, William Connor from the Shankill Road, and he was denied some of his money because he painted the Queen taller than the King, would you believe, and didn't have enough faces actually in the portrait. So we had the first Parliament of Northern Ireland, and you can see, or you may not be able to see just so clearly, but the two bookends that are sitting there are the first women members of the new Northern Ireland Parliament. Deirdre Chichester on the left and Julia McMurdy on the right. Deirdre Chichester's husband passed away and she becomes Deirdre Chichester Parker. She's a good lady. She's buried in Castle Dawson churchyard. And, really look her up because she's committed to Northern Ireland. She held so many positions within Northern Ireland, within the state structures of Northern Ireland for so many years. Fabulous woman. And Julia McMurdy was the wife of McMurdy, who actually brought about the Young Citizens Volunteers in Belfast City Hall. And she also supported returning veterans as well from World War I. Carson moves on and becomes Baron Carson of Dunkern, moving into the Lords. And it's in the Lords that he made one of his most bitterest of speeches with regards to his sense of betrayal by English government ministers. 24th of June 1921, the British coalition government's cabinet decided to propose talks with Sinn Féin, with the leaders of Sinn Féin. That actually led to that document, the IRA's document, copy of the letter of the Chief of Staff of the Irish Republican Army, suspending military operations against the British, and that document's dated the 9th of July 1921. It was the 11th of July 1921 whenever the truce came into effect in the south and in Donegal, but not in the new state of Northern Ireland. Violence continued within the boundaries of the state. Eamon de Valera himself arrived over in London on the 14th of July 1921, and he arrived with Austin Stack, Arthur Griffiths and Erskine Childers, all senior figures within the Republican movement. He had left an angry and bitter Michael Collins behind at that stage back in Ireland. Lloyd George had made it very clear to Eamon de Valera in those talks between the 14th and the 21st of July 1921 that a republic was out of the question, that Ireland was going to have to remain within the empire with dominion status. So Lloyd George was pulling no punches with regards to that. The sparring that was taking place between Eamon de Valera and Lloyd George was complicated by James Craig's presence and interference. Craig had personally went to London as a physical reminder of Northern Ireland's existence, and his presence was an obstacle to Lloyd George and his government with regards to their dealings with the Sinn Féin representatives. Craig had ignored Lloyd George's appeal to enter in and participate in talks and discussions, and he took every opportunity to inform the press that Eamon de Valera's claim to represent and speak for the whole of Ireland was an outrageous impertinence as far as the Northern Ireland government of the day was concerned. With Craig's presence being felt throughout, Lord George stated in his proposals that partition was to remain in force until the people of Northern Ireland decided otherwise. Craig's strategy was very, very simple. He determined that he would sit on his Ulster rock and defend Northern Ireland's position. Eamon de Valera left Downing Street without the British proposals. Before they got on the train to get back to the ferry, he sent somebody back to Downing Street to pick up the proposals, to bring them back to Ireland for discussion and debate. 20th of July, Lloyd George declared to his own cabinet that no consideration would be given to Sinn Féin's demands for a republic. Arthur Griffith was encouraged by the proposals that had come from the British. Cathal Brugha was opposed completely to those proposals. So it shows the divisions that were within the Republican movement at that stage. You had the hardliners, the Hawks, the Zealots, and the Doves. More practical people like Michael Collins, who was working for some form of independence. On the 29th of September 1921, Lloyd George approached Sinn Féin again in a letter to break the impasse that was existing between them. And the Dáil in the Mansion House again debated and then gracefully accepted Lloyd George's offer and arranged to send a delegation to London that did not include Eamon de Valera, which is a very controversial action of Eamon de Valera staying away. And a lot of people have their suspicions about why he done so. Some people say it was because he knew that they weren't going to get what he wanted to have, and he knew that that would create great division within the Republican movement. But the Irish plenipotentiaries that did go back to London on the 9th of October 1921 included Michael Collins, Arthur Griffith, Robert Barton, who was the Dáil's Minister of Economic Affairs, and Dáil deputies Eamon Duggan and George Gavin Duffy, and the secretary for those plenipotentiaries was Erskine Childers. Erskine Childers was an Eamon de Valera man. Duffy and Barton would be sympathetic to Eamon de Valera, and Collins and Griffith were at one with each other with regards to progress. The British team at that particular time for those talks included Lloyd George, Winston Churchill, Lord Birkenhead, Austen Chamberlain, who were all well accustomed to the push and thrust of British politics and those forms of negotiations that were taking place. Whereas the Dáil deputies, the Irish plenipotentiaries, didn't have that much of experience with regards to this form of negotiation. 11th of October 1921, the first meeting of the British-Irish Conference took place. Over the next 2 months after that, would you believe there were 7 plenary sessions, 24 sub-conferences, and 9 special committee meetings, all around these negotiations. During the negotiations, Lloyd George had to spend as much time talking to James Craig as he had to spend talking to the Sinn Féin delegates. Because Craig was the ever-present. Craig was on his shoulder, looking over his shoulder, trying to get information, trying to give him information, trying to guide from the outside, while not giving an inch from what he perceived to be the new state of Northern Ireland. So Lloyd George was very much aware of Craig's presence, and Craig was very much aware of Lloyd George, his cunning and duplicity that could endanger Northern Ireland's vulnerability. So Craig was aware of all that was going on. The British delegation sent their final proposals to the Irish delegation of plenipotentiaries on the 1st of December 1921. The Irish delegates then returned to Dublin for a crucial meeting of the Dáil. During that meeting of the Dáil, Michael Collins went outside and he met with members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and he shared the proposals with them. And he talked about the oath of allegiance. And the Irish Republican Brotherhood members went off and discussed an oath of allegiance. And they came back and met with Michael Collins, and they gave Michael Collins an oath of allegiance that he could work on, that they would sign up to. And Michael Collins returned with that oath of allegiance to London with the other plenipotentiaries. The treaty negotiations, the main issues, they're all in the booklet, so I'm not going to go through each and all of them. But certainly, partition was a primary issue during this period of negotiation. Arthur Griffith agreed at one point to actually support a boundary commission, an Irish boundary commission, to determine the border between the north and the south. Now, the Irish delegation believed that an Irish boundary commission would cut huge chunks out of Northern Ireland and present it to the south. It wasn't happening, it wasn't going to happen, and it didn't happen with regards to their final report that didn't come out until 1925 and was suppressed till 1969. But there was only small bits that were changed over from the north and the south. Michael Collins did meet with Lord Birkenhead, got on very, very well with him, and they agreed the wording of an oath of allegiance that was based on the Irish Republican Brotherhood's wording that they had given to Michael Collins and Lord Birkenhead's thoughts about what an oath of allegiance should be within the treaty. Griffith was trying to hold back, and Lloyd George produced 2 letters. One, he said, would be sent to James Craig, telling him that a treaty had been made and peace was the option, and peace would be restored. The other would say the conference was a failure and had broken down and war would be resumed. And he asked Griffith and company which letter did they want him to send. The Irish delegation left Downing Street and went not far from Downing Street to Hans Place, a house in Hans Place, where most of the Irish delegation were actually staying, apart from one, Michael Collins. Michael Collins had his own staff of members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and they stayed at Cadogan Gardens, not far from Hans Place, but they weren't together. They discussed and debated the proposals the rest of the evening of the 5th of December 1921. And in the early hours of the 6th of December 1921, they returned to Downing Street to sign the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. And that's the signatures that they had left on the treaty document. The newspapers the next morning published the signatories, the agreement. Eamon de Valera back in Dublin had heard the agreement had been signed and was furious. He hadn't seen the agreement. He was furious that the delegates hadn't brought it back for discussion to the Dáil as had been agreed. But he never looked at the document. It was the process that he was furious with. He's going to get furious with the document later on, of course. Can't see Eamon saying, oh, God save the Queen or the King and all the rest. But the reality was he was strongly opposed to the document. That's what was agreed, basically, and again, that's in the booklet itself. When the Dáil actually accepted the treaty on the 7th of January 1922, Eamon de Valera still bitterly opposed to it. And he stood for re-election as the president and was defeated. The presidency of the new state went to Arthur Griffith. Erskine Childers demonstrated the tension within the Dáil when he started shouting at Arthur Griffith. It was there was a terrible exchange between former comrades. Countess Markovich, the first elected woman, had a terrible exchange with Michael Collins. They weren't being very courteous to each other, shall we say. And those opposed to the treaty, those 57 opposed to the treaty, walked out of the Dáil. 64 members, pro-treaty supporters, that had carried the vote in a democratically elected government of the South remained. So Eamon de Valera not only opposed the Anglo-Irish Treaty, but he opposed his own government's democratic vote, where 64 people voted for and 57 people voted against. All that, of course, is going to lead to further conflict, civil war in the South. And, it's the walkout itself, damaging those relationships, was beneficial to Northern Ireland. It gave Northern Ireland some breathing space to get the structures of governance in place, to increase their levels of security and border security. And also, of course, with the Civil War, they were fighting each other, not the North. James Craig, again being the man he was, met with Michael Collins, 1922, January. And one of the couriers between them was a woman called Winifred Carney. Winifred Carney had been one of the revolutionary socialists of James Connolly's Irish Citizens' Army during the Easter Rising of 1916. And she was a courier between messages between Craig and Collins. And Craig had said to Collins at one stage, for the present, an All-Ireland Parliament was out of the question. Possibly in years to come, 10, 20, or 50 years, Ulster might be tempted to join with the South. Ulster hasn't been fully tempted, even 100 years later. During that time, the Ulster Anthem was a hymn. Oh God, your help. So I hope for years to come we still have God's help with regards to the maintenance of the Union and the state of Northern Ireland. Thank you very much.